Hello, I'm Sam Gruber, an art and architectural historian. Some of you may know me because I've given several lectures for the speakers program during the pandemic. This talk is the first in a new series of recorded presentations that will do a deeper dive into buildings, spaces, places that are important in the history of Jewish heritage. In my previous talks, I've done some rather broad, sweeping presentations of different themes. Now, I guess by popular demand, we're going to look a little bit more closely and get to know a few of my favorite places more intimately. And in the process, I hope that we will learn a little bit about history, a little bit about architecture, and a little bit about art. We'll answer some questions, and I'm sure we're going to ask a lot more. Thank you, CSP, for allowing me to make this presentation and for encouraging me to put together some future tours. And I'd like to especially thank Ed Medros and the congregation at the Walnut Street Shul for inviting me in the past and showing me around. And I'd like to dedicate this talk to them. Thank you. I will invite you to join me in Chelsea, Massachusetts today as we launch our series at the Walnut Street Shul. I first became acquainted with this remarkable building and congregation over 30 years ago when I visited in 1990. And I've been delighted in the last 5 years to become more deeply involved with the congregation again, and to witness and in some ways participate in their efforts to revive their congregation, but more importantly for me, to protect and preserve this important building for future generations. So here we go. I'm looking forward to this visit with you to the Walnut Street Shul in Chelsea, Massachusetts. Here we are in the sanctuary of Temple or Congregation Agudath Shalom in Chelsea, Massachusetts, and you can see that it's quite a large and very stunning place. We'll come into the sanctuary in just a minute and take a closer look, but I wanted to get you inside to have a glimpse so you know that there is essentially a treasure that awaits. The congregation is the last surviving Orthodox congregation in Chelsea, which is essentially an extension of Boston. It's just across the water. It was an immigrant suburb for Jews, but they replaced an earlier Protestant sort of country and seaside population when they arrived in larger numbers in the late 19th century. Chelsea was known in the early 20th century as one of the great Jewish centers in America. This is largely forgotten now because we only think of New York's Lower East Side as the incubator of American Ashkenazi Jewry. But Chelsea by the 1920s was as densely populated with Jews as New York's Lower East Side. There were almost 20, I think there were 18 synagogues, functioning synagogues at the time, and the town wasn't fully Jewish. It was an immigrant population with Poles and Italians as well, but it was identifiably Jewish to those people who lived there, but also to those people in the greater Boston area, and it even had a national reputation. It was a moment in history that essentially passed quickly, as we'll discover, because the Jews of Chelsea enjoyed the opportunities of America and therefore experienced the process of outmigration from their first dense centers of population as they sort of experienced more of what we'll call the American dream. Each generation redefined itself, and as they did so, they tended to move further and further from their immigrant roots. But as Jews have moved out of Chelsea, the synagogue has remained. and it is a survivor. And it's remarkable that it has survived in intact, pristine condition, because many older synagogues that have survived from the late 19th or early 20th century have been transformed in many ways, either transformed and modernized as their congregations have stayed put, but changed their ritual, changed their liturgy, changed their aesthetics, and therefore changed the decoration and organization of their buildings. But more frequently, older synagogues have been changed so much so that their Jewish identity has been stripped, and if they survive at all, they've been sold and used for other purposes, for theaters, for recreation centers, or even transformed into condominiums today in places where the real estate market is hot. So it's remarkable that we have Agudath Shalom, or the Walnut Street Shul, intact today. About more than, well, it's actually more than 100 years after it was built. The congregation was founded in the late 19th century and went through several iterations. It had a substantial building that was destroyed in a big fire that swept Chelsea in 1909. And the congregation quickly rebuilt, and they rebuilt in a more impressive way with a big brick building that could seat over 1,000 people. And it really spoke to the expansion of the Jewish community in Chelsea just at that time, and also the aspirations of this Orthodox community. It was, by the 1920s, it was joined by many other congregations. As I said, there were 18 in all, but this is the only functioning Orthodox congregation. There is one Reform congregation in Chelsea, but that occupies a former church building. It was not a purpose-built synagogue like this one. So you get a quick view of the exterior. We'll look more carefully, and you'll see the interior. It's remarkable for its large space in the sanctuary, but as we'll see, it has other spaces of interest, and it's remarkable for its painted decoration and for the carved wooden ark. So outside, you can see it hasn't changed much. These are two old photos, one from, I believe, the 1950s, which is the earliest photo that I could find, a black and white view, and then my own photo from 1990. And if you compare that photo with one taken in 2018, you'll see there's very little difference except the models of the cars parked on the street. And when I was there in 2018, even things like the electrical systems hadn't been changed in almost 100 years. But fortunately, recently, the congregation has gotten some grant money, and they've been upgrading those sorts of essential utilities, and also increasing security and other necessary functions, but without changing the essence of the building and its decoration. What you see here is a big blocky building. It's not architecturally experimental or distinctive. It's essentially like a big brick shoebox with two towers stuck on the front. And this was a very common type of synagogue design, particularly for Orthodox congregations from the late 19th century on. It's very functional, very easy to build. They're using bricks, so relatively cheap materials. The decoration is just using colored brick, a yellow brick against the red. There's very little applied decoration, not even cheap cast terracotta that you'll find on some buildings. It has a very modern feel because the surfaces are so flat. But this was built in 1910, so it's a period where historicism, that is reference to the past, is still important, but people are looking towards simpler and newer architectural solutions. So the historical references are these Gothic arches, pointed Gothic arches in the front, and then you have two little cupolas on top of the towers. But other than that, the design is not that much different from a school building of the time. And there is this big school catty-corner to the synagogue, and you can look at the two of them together and see that they are both part and parcel of a kind of institutional building of the early 20th century. Here you see the towers very prominently, and they really stood up in this community, which was at this time still a low density area, and relatively low level. So 2-story houses mostly, a few 3-story apartment buildings pushing up, but these towers would have soared over the neighboring buildings at the time, and they would have stood out as a symbol of Jewish presence and Jewish pride. The towers are symbolic. Beginning in the mid-19th century, we begin getting 2-tower facades in Europe, very common in Berlin, in Vienna, and other places. And then this migrates to the United States. For some, the towers were symbolic of the columns that are said to have been on the front of the Temple of Solomon, as described in the Book of Kings, these columns called Yakim and Boaz. There's also some reconstructions of the Temple of Jerusalem that begin to be circulating, well, actually even going back to the 1600s, but in the 19th century, some so-called archaeologically correct interpretations of the temple, that they're not particularly correct, but they were touted as such and became popular and widely disseminated through prints and encyclopedias and whatnot. And in some ways, the blockiness of this building recalls that type of restoration. But the towers are also very functional, because this is an Orthodox congregation and the men and women inside are seated separately. And what became the norm, and this actually goes back to the synagogue in Amsterdam in the late 1600s, the women are moved upstairs into a gallery, and they get to the gallery by stair towers. Often they enter from outside the main building, and one can do that here actually at the Walnut Street Shul. There's a side entrance into one of these towers. And they use the towers to get up into the balcony. Now, in the Walnut Street Shul, the main sanctuary itself is actually on the 2nd floor. So everybody has to go upstairs to get someplace. You have a front stairs, impressive sort of flight between the towers that you can enter sort of ceremonially from the street, and that leads you into a vestibule. And then the women can peel off if necessary and go in the stair towers to get to the 3rd level. But the men enter then from the top of those exterior stairs and go into the sanctuary that we've seen before. So we can think of the towers as symbolic of maybe the temple in Jerusalem, and we can think of them as emblematic of the Jewish presence. That is, they're tall and they're sort of rivaling church spires in other parts of Boston. And then we can think of them as fully functional because they have to house these necessary stair towers. The 2-tower theme is very common around Boston. And these are just 2 other examples of synagogues that I've visited in the past. One is Temple Israel, former Temple Israel, which is in Boston proper. And that's was built in 1885, and you see it is more church-like. It has the 2 towers, but it has these pointed spires, and it has round arches, very similar to Romanesque churches, or a popular style also for synagogues in the late 19th century. And then another example, which is the great Blue Hill Synagogue, former Blue Hill Synagogue. It's now also a church in Roxbury, which has towers similar to the ones at the Walnut Street Shul with these cupolas on top, but the towers here are articulated with much more decoration, kind of Romanesque design, whereas the towers in Chelsea are simpler. And that's probably partly taste, but more budget. The congregation surely was watching the bottom line, and they wanted the architect to build something useful and beautiful, but also as simple as he could. Interestingly, these 2 other synagogues that I'm showing you here both employed Jewish architects. And this is an area that still needs to be researched more, but there were a lot of Jewish architects in Boston beginning in the late 19th century. So Weisbahn of Weisbahn and Jones came from Europe. He trained in Europe, but became an architect in Boston by the 1870s. And David Crokin, who was one of the partners building the Blue Hill Synagogue, he lived till about 1960 and was a very prominent architect and designed many other synagogues in Boston. But interesting, the Orthodox congregation in Chelsea chose an architect who was not Jewish. and a man named Joll. We don't know a lot about him, but he was one of 3 architects who was very involved in building in Chelsea, and he was used by the city for many buildings. But the Walnut Street Shul that we see here is really his biggest surviving building, or building that we know was designed by him. So it's curious, but not unusual that a non-Jewish architect would be employed. But by the early 20th century, it was certainly possible for congregations to choose Jewish architects in the United States in a way it would have been difficult 50 years earlier. Because in the second half of the 20th century, many Jews enter the architectural profession first as apprentices. Some are trained in Europe and come as young men, and they find apprenticeships or partnerships, usually with German Christian architects, because they all speak German. So they're part of this larger German-speaking immigrant community. But by the 1880s, we also find Jews attending the new architecture schools, like MIT especially. MIT and Cornell actually take a number of Jewish students, so that these architects begin to lead in the profession by the end of the 19th and early 20th century. And then at that time, the floodgates open and many Jews start attending both engineering schools and architecture schools in America. It's an honorable profession for Jews because it's art, but it's also business. So the parents can say, my son, the doctor, my son, the lawyer, but also my son, the architect. He's in business. He makes a living. He can support his family. This is a timeline of some of the shuls, the congregations in Chelsea. This is
I'm stopping you for a moment. It was when, especially in this slide and in general, because of the computer, what happens when you talk with your hands is that they're like in front of your face. So just let's see in this slide, if you can use like the mouse pointer to take us through the slide, and then like the eyes will go more there. You did it in part of the slides already where you pointed with the mouse. Okay.
So this image, Milestones in the History of Jewish Chelsea and the Queen of Shuls, is borrowed from the Chelsea congregation, from the Walnut Street Shul, part of their display. And it gives you some sense of where the current building fits in this line of Chelsea history. So 1909, 1911, you'll see current building is constructed with 4 floors and 1,109 seats in the sanctuary. That's men and women together. But you'll see 1864, the first Jewish resident of Chelsea, Nathan Morse, arrives. And then we have some history continuing, but significant. 1993 is when the Walnut Street Synagogue was added to the National Register of Historic Places. And that really begins the period of people paying attention and working more actively to make sure this synagogue doesn't close and be transformed or demolished like so many of its predecessors. Already in the early 90s, when I was shown the synagogue by a man named Stanley Smith of Historic Boston, at that time we were trying to save and successfully save the Vilna Shul in Boston proper, which is a little bit later from 1919. This was already recognized as a rarity. And it wasn't on the register, but Stan took me there and he said, this is a building we cannot lose. And fortunately, the congregation, small as it was, recognized that, and over the years has rallied to protect and preserve the building. And now they're very actively doing that. And I'll explain a little bit more about how they're going to do that. These are some maps. These are actually in the collection of the synagogue, because one of the aspects of using and saving the synagogue for the future is not only to continue it as a place for religious services, but to make it into a cultural center and historic center for all of the Jewish history of Chelsea. And to some extent, they're actually casting their net wider and collecting materials from synagogues that are closing in other towns within the greater Boston metropolitan area, because there's a big demographic shift. These are city atlases. Every city has them. These are from the 1920s, but you can see in these maps the density of Chelsea at that time. The red buildings are brick and the yellow buildings are wood. And obviously after a fire, the fire of 1909, there's a great move to rebuilding in brick. And this is part of that process. And if you look closely, you'll see this big school in the center there, but the synagogue is just cat-corner to it. And here's a detail. You can see that it's one of the largest buildings in the entire neighborhood. But for today's purposes, it suffers because it only has a little empty lot next to it, which is used for parking. But because it's a dense early 20th century urban neighborhood, there's not much parking available elsewhere. So when the synagogue is used for community events, that's one of the issues that confronts it. There is parking at the school across the way, and there are partnerships that are being developed, and we'll see where that goes in the future. Did I mention how Chelsea changed like so many other Jewish immigrant neighborhoods? Most of that change came through education. And as the children of immigrants went to school, went to the local public schools, they went to evening school, as you see here, evening school, Chelsea Evening School graduating class from 1912. They got jobs, they moved on, and they eventually moved to better neighborhoods. This accelerated after World War I. And then obviously the big outmigration from older Jewish centers took place after World War II, and the GI Bill allowed so many children and grandchildren of immigrants to finance homes and move into newly built suburbs where they founded new congregations, and the old ones, they left behind. So this is just a photo from the collection at the Walnut Street Shul. They've been amassing lots of materials on Chelsea Jewish history, but I think it's indicative of this transformation of an immigrant community. All the people here would have been children of immigrants. Many of them would have been immigrants themselves, having arrived between 1880 and 1912 when this photo was taken as immigrants, but they are being Americanized, and that was part of the mission of the educational system at that time, and also the social system. All of the social organizations were geared toward mainstreaming Jews into American society. For some, that meant giving up their Judaism, but not so much as in Europe. Here, the shift meant giving up Orthodox practice and gradually moving to conservative and then to even Reform. And that changed the profile, the face of American Judaism. And as we will see going forward, I hope in future talks, it changes the face of American synagogue architecture. Only one other of these 18 synagogues still survives, and that's the former Chestnut Street Shul, and it's now a church, though it still has its Hebrew inscription over the doorway. And that's just around the corner from the Walnut Street Shul. It's much smaller, but you can still visit it today. So let's go inside. Let's start with going inside the towers, what it would be like. We come up the stairs and through these big doors, and then we go to the left or right. Today we only go to the right because one of the stair towers needs to be fixed. But on the left, we have the stairs that take us down into the basement level. And I won't take you on a tour of the basement level. It's filled with, when I was last there in 2019, it was still filled with all sorts of junk. It was like old stoves and boxes of God knows what, and old prayer books. Gradually that will be, maybe it's already been cleared out and restored. But it is a big space. It's a big space, and it would have been used for many things originally. But we see the stairs on the other side going from the first floor, which is used regularly, and then up to the second floor of the sanctuary, and then the third floor of the women's gallery. Here you see those towers again, and we see the side of the building, and the side of the building tells us something very useful. We can often know from the outside how a building functions. I've already mentioned the towers are functional with the stairs, but if we look at the windows on the side, we see that there are two levels of windows. And what that means generally is that there is a women's gallery when we look inside, because there has to be a floor level between these two window levels. If you look at other synagogues, you'll see that there are just big windows that go all the way up to the ceiling. And that usually means there's a single sanctuary space without differentiation of levels. Not always, but usually this tells us that we're looking at an Orthodox shul. Today, there is a highway that leads to a bridge that abuts the synagogue. So obviously that impinges on the integrity of the site, but it fortunately, when that was built and there was a move to tear down the building, that was resisted. But in many cities that I visited, including many, especially in the Northeast in New England, like Springfield, Massachusetts, or New Haven, Connecticut, almost all the old synagogues were torn down during urban renewal of the 1960s and 70s when new highways and the like were put in. So again, because we're lucky in so many ways that this building survives. Here you can see how tight that connection is. All right, let's go inside to the first floor. Briefly, the first floor is the floor that actually gets used the most. And this is traditional in many synagogues, and it was true in Europe as well as America, because the big sanctuaries, even in the most pious communities, just don't get filled most of the time. They're used for the high holidays, they're used maybe for big community events or prayer sessions, maybe for weddings or a bar mitzvah, but sometimes on Shabbat when everybody, a lot of people from the community come. But in America, where a lot of men had to work on Saturdays, even Orthodox men found themselves having to choose between their business and their religious life. The sanctuaries, the big sanctuaries were not filled very often. And the prayer spaces for daily prayers, and even sometimes for Sabbath prayers, were in smaller spaces, and these would be on the ground floor. We think of a bet midrash, a study hall, as a regular daily minyan place, and also essentially a social club for the community. And that was certainly, there was such a place, and we'll see it in a second, at the Walnut Street Shul. And that's where the Orthodox men would be studying, and then they would also pray, and they would kibitz, they would schmooze. I mean, that was part of life. It's where they would go. There weren't that many other social options open to immigrants at that time, religious immigrants. There were socialist clubs, and there were political clubs, and there were Yiddishite literary clubs. But for the religious, the synagogue was their home. Today, there's also a separate space that you see here, which is for the daily prayers and for Shabbat. It's a smaller room that's been created with its own reader's table and ark. But the Bet Midrash is a bigger space, and this is also used regularly. And here we see the mechitza, the separation for men and women, off to the left. In this case, it's set up both for prayers, but also when I was there, we had lunch right on one of these tables. And there's a beautiful ark as well. You'll see there's some other arks that have been collected off to the side. And this whole area eventually will be turned into some kind of exhibition space, museum space. And many of the artifacts that are being assembled from closed synagogues in the area are winding up here. Now, funds are needed, professional help is needed, and I know that the congregation is looking for partnerships with libraries and with museums and other institutions to help them move in this direction. So here we see a place that is regularly used, and even today, this is a place that feels very lived in. And if you come on a Monday or Thursday, you'll find might help make a minyan for a Torah reading. And if you come on other days, you're likely to find some people still here. It's a small congregation, and many of them don't live in the neighborhood. I guess it's a kind of don't ask, don't tell how you get to this Orthodox shul, but once you're there, you're fully practicing traditional values. This is just before the pandemic, 2019. This is when it was very full. I happened to be there for what was called Founders Day. And this was an effort to reach out to a broader community. And the organizers were tracking down descendants of shul members and people who had spent their youth in this synagogue, but had moved on. And it was a great turnout. A huge crowd filled the sanctuary upstairs for talks and speeches and music and stories. And it was really an optimistic moment. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. So we're hoping that in the future, this kind of participation will continue going forward. So this is the Ark in the Bet Midrash, and we won't dwell on it, but it just gives you a hint of what we're going to see upstairs. It's like the minor leagues and the major leagues are upstairs, but you'll see the carved lions here. There's the separation space for women, and there the lions on the downstairs Ark. Note the columns, and then there's a beautiful parochet that is made. I believe it was by the sisterhood at one point for the congregation. The inscription is very explicit. So these are carved wooden lions. We don't know who the artist was, but we do know the names of some of these immigrant artists, and some people are doing research. Some of you may recall there was a marvelous exhibition about 10 or 15 years ago at the Folk Museum in New York called Gilded Lions, Wooden Horse and Gilded Lions, something. Murray Zimilis did this show about all the wood carvers who both carved arks like this one and carousel horses. And in Boston, the Boston area, we know the name of one of these cabinet makers, carvers, and that's San Katz. And we do know that he created the Ark in the sanctuary upstairs. And here we're going to go upstairs, and very quickly you see it's a fully intact Orthodox arrangement. We have a central bima, very high and very big, so a lot of people can get up there. We have a large ark that really is 2 stories tall, and then the women's gallery. The women's gallery, unlike very strict Orthodox congregations today, the women's galleries in the immigrant communities were much more accessible. You don't have a big barrier, a grill, or a window. Women could see, they could lean over, they could be seen. They had a great view of the Ark, and the sound traveled. It's really not a horrible place to be. It does separate men and women, but it doesn't really denigrate women in the way many older women's sections do in European synagogues that I visited. And I have to say, I'm not an Orthodox Jew, so I can say this frankly, I feel the way many congregations do today, which really enclose women in a separate space, which separates them from the beauty of the service and the words of the Torah. So, but here the congregation really assembled together, and there was almost equal number of seats for men and women, which suggests that women did come to the synagogue fairly regularly. Many synagogues have very small women's galleries because the understanding was women didn't have to come to the synagogue and they wouldn't come to the synagogue. In America, though, what we learn is that women often kept things going, because I said men sometimes had to work on the Sabbath. Women were the ones who kept the synagogues going. The sisterhoods, I mentioned the parochet was made from a sisterhood. They're the ones who raised money, sometimes even for the building of the synagogues themselves. The American Jewish women really reinvented their role. And today, 100 years later, we see this very clearly, certainly in the Reform and conservative movements, where we have not just clergy, but we have presidents of congregations and boards that are made up with many women, and sometimes even a majority of women. This congregation, I don't know the status today, but this congregation was very controversial. Just about a few years before the pandemic, actually appointed a woman rabbi, an Orthodox woman rabbi, to lead the Walnut Street Shul. This was unique, but it does point to a direction among some branches of Orthodoxy that the role of women can be greatly expanded, both in the community, but also in synagogue ritual life. Now, I want to point out the painting here. This is really remarkable. The ceiling here is the most dramatic part of the whole composition. It's this sky, a cloudy night sky, and then you can hardly see it, but over the Ark, the sun is rising. We'll take a closer look. We have a painted medallion here where the chandelier hangs, and then over the Ark, we have curtains. These are common motifs. The curtains are common motifs in European synagogues, and it's a sign of honor. We have curtains behind portraits of royalty. Sometimes we have curtains behind Torah representations of the Ten Commandments. It's a sign of honor. Sometimes the curtains will open up in some representations to show a kind of paradisical scene representing, through Torah, we might get to a more beautiful life, eternal life. But not here. We just have the white wall with these Zionist stars. I think the stars might be later, but I don't know. But 1910, this is a period where Zionism is already taking hold among the Orthodox, especially here in America. Not the Reform are rejecting it, but the Orthodox see a future a Jewish presence in the land of Israel. And so the star, which becomes the sign of Zionism beginning in the 1890s, begins to pop up a lot in Jewish places. Before that, it was usually the menorah or the tablets of the law. You wouldn't see the Magen David at all. Here's some views from the women's gallery, and you can see it's relatively comfortable, and you can see the full view of decoration. And I want you to see the sky. I want you to see the curtains. I want you to see this big ark with kind of electric lights, very popular then. Electrification was just coming in. Before that, it was gas lighting. And the decorative quality of the electric lights, it's like Coney Island, it's like an amusement park, but it's really meant to be like the sun rising. And then we have a faux architecture, columns painted on the side, and also columns flanking the ark and the curtains. And these also might be, you think of them as Yakim and Boaz if you'd like. Looking down, we see the big bima, and it's nicely arranged. You'll note that the Orthodox synagogue doesn't have a central aisle. It has everyone's centered around the bima where the Torah is read, because that's the center event. They don't focus as much on the ark as many post-World War II synagogues do. The bima, the reader's table, is the place of the key event. And then, of course, when the Torah is taken from the ark, having this type of arrangement allows you to process with the Torah, to take it around the congregation so everybody can revere it or pay homage to it, kiss it, whatever their practice is, before it's taken and opened and read to the congregation. Views of the ark, and here you see the cabinetry. This is kind of classical, kind of colonial.
I'm stopping you for a moment. Can you go back for a moment? There's a mechitza here in this photo. Can you say a few just words about how come and what is that mechitza for?
So in this photo, in addition to the bima and the seating arrangement, you can see a modern addition, which is a mechitza. That is a very simple separation. And this is to allow women today to sit in the sanctuary. They don't have to climb up to the gallery. This is a practice that we find in many older synagogues, where it's both physically difficult sometimes for women to get up to the gallery, but also social practices have changed, and the congregations recognize an essential equality of men and women, and everyone deserves to be close to the ark and close to the bima, but they still practice separation of sexes. Because there's no central aisle here, you can't have one side for men and one side for women, as you do in some contemporary Orthodox synagogues, like the new Lincoln Square Synagogue in New York, for instance. But just by having these curtains erected here, you can have women sit to the side. So it's not egalitarian, but it's a lot more equal than previous practice. And I've seen these in the back, I've seen them on the side, I've seen some of them very low and symbolic, some of them very high with kind of eye holes, kind of punched in sheets that are just hung like on a clothesline in the back. It all depends on the number of people in the congregation, the insistence of the women, and of course the budget. So sometimes an artist will be hired and you'll have a beautiful new mechitza design, and sometimes there'll just be sheets hung in the back. So I mentioned San Katz. Katz was born in Lviv, or was then Lvov of Poland, formerly Lemberg of Austria. And he was one of just dozens and dozens of trained craftspeople who came to America. He emigrated here in 1907, so he was already in his 20s, so he would have brought his craft. And we know that in the Boston and New England area, he designed over and built over 24 arks, several of which have been documented and many of which have been preserved. And probably he did the one in the Walnut Street Shul, which I mentioned earlier. He certainly did a beautiful ark in the Agudath Street Shul in Newton just a few years after this one. This is one of his largest. It's actually not as ornate as some of them. What Katz did, he kind of combined American style of colonial revival, although you could also say it's Renaissance, but it's this classicism, the columns, and we find this in synagogue architecture of the time as well, but with Jewish themes, and always the Ten Commandments and the lions. Sometimes, though, he also includes an American eagle. It's not the eagle of the Russian Empire or the Austrian Empire. It is the American eagle, and it really kind of tops off the ark to show people, they have arrived in a new land, but not here. So here are the lions, and we see they're quite beautifully carved, and these are the norm. We find the lions as both protectors of the law and as supporters of the law, and emblematic of the Jewish people. In synagogues in many different forms. We see them on Torah mantles. We see them embroidered on Torah mantles. We see them on the Torah curtains, on the Ark curtains, on the parochet, and we see them carved on the arks. So just by comparison, this is also about 1910. This is a mural that comes from a no longer extant synagogue. It's now an apartment building. In Burlington, Vermont. It's a project that I think I may have mentioned in one of my other lectures, but it's something that I and a number of people have been working on for many years, for a decade. And it was extracted from that former Orthodox Shul in Burlington, Vermont, and installed in the current conservative synagogue, the successor synagogue, Mohaved Zedek. And actually, since this photo was taken, the conservation restoration has been completed just this year in 2022. But I want you to see, this is a painted mural from above the ark area from that synagogue. And again, we have the lions and the tablets of the law, and we have a crown of the Torah, and we have the sun rising, and we have curtains. And then we look into this paradisiacal landscape beyond. So at the Walnut Street Shul, we have some of these elements. We have the sky, and Burlington probably would have had a painted sky too. And we have curtains, and you can just make out at the edge, there's the sun rising over the edge. And I'll get back to that. And we have a few other examples. This is a daytime sky from the Sons of Jacob Synagogue in Providence, Rhode Island, from about 1922, also a remarkable building. These, we've had painted ceilings in synagogues for centuries, and this is the reconstructed ceiling of the Gvurdzhits, Ukraine synagogue from the 17th century, which has now been recreated in the Polin synagogue, Polin Museum in Warsaw. But coming back to Chelsea, this is, I think, the most remarkable painted ceiling of any synagogue that survives, immigrant synagogue that survives in America. And it's very ambitious, very ambitious. So here, looking right up, we see the sun rising over the edge. And we have to remember the ark is right below us. So we're sort of looking east. And then as the sun rises, it's flanked by peacocks. I can't tell you what the meaning of these peacocks are. They could just be paradisiacal animals. They're animals that we find going back to antiquity in art and even in Jewish art. Some people think the many eyes of the tail of the feathers of a peacock are like the seeds of a pomegranate or the nuts in a pine cone. These are symbolic, representing the 613 commandments. We don't know what was in the mind of the artist. We don't even know the name of the artist of this wall. But just to show you, for example, these are peacocks from the Jewish catacombs, the one of the Rondinini catacombs in Rome. And this photo on the right, this was taken in the 1860s, and these were fairly well known. I don't know if around 1910 photos were still circulating, but it's conceivable. I can't say it's true or not that the artist actually had a Jewish source for his peacocks, but there were plenty of other peacocks to look at, and peacocks were exotic, and they could represent, this eternal realm. Just a comparison, you see how similar they are. And just to let you know, other painters in other synagogues were also including exotic birds. The parrot, I think the parrot has no particular meaning in Judaism, none that I know, but this is a trompe-l'oeil painting from the one surviving painted synagogue in Lviv, Ukraine, from the 1920s, known as the Tzuri Gilad Synagogue. So you can see it's part and parcel of a style, of a theme that was popular at the time. This is fine art painting. These were trained painters. This is not just your immigrant off the boat, splashing something on the wall saying, oh, wouldn't this be nice? These are painters who probably were trained as theater painters, as was the painter in Burlington, Benzion Black. He did theater sets, and he was a sign painter. They might have decorated restaurants and ballrooms, because in the late 19th and early 20th century, nobody liked just white walls. Everything had to be painted. And that would all change with modernism. But at the time, painted decoration, and the more illusionistic, the better, was certainly the norm, certainly high class. Now, I mentioned that chandelier, and look at this medallion. This is a sort of illusionistic medallion. It's all flat paint, but it's made to look like metal. And then around the edge of it, between the metal and the sky, this is all painted, you see shrubbery, flowers, and then embedded in the flowers is a nest of birds, are these beautiful birds. You can walk into the Walnut Street Shul and not see this. You have to look and look carefully, and you're shown this. Again, I don't know whether there's anything symbolic, but it's a beautiful image of a kind of congregation nestling under this paradisical sky. Looking towards the other end, we have a few other points of interest, particularly over the women's gallery in the rear and the entrance wall. There's a large painted panel. And I want to look at this a little bit more carefully. Here you see it on the right, and then next to it is the trap door that gets you up to fix things on the roof. The women weren't expected to go up there. They sat below. So this is a painting. The National Register nomination 1993 calls this the Tomb of Rachel. This is not the Tomb of Rachel. It doesn't look anything like the Tomb of Rachel. It's also been called the Tomb of Ruth, which is not a very common motif, but it was visited by pilgrims in the 19th century, a site called the Tomb of Ruth. But more likely, this is meant to be the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs in Hebron. And there are many different ways in which it is represented, but this particular motif we find in several printed and painted decorations from the early 20th century. Now, this I'm showing you just for comparison. This is the Kotel. This is the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. This is a little scene painted in an older synagogue, but probably painted in the 19-teens or 20s in the synagogue in Rymanów, Poland. These types of scenes of the Holy Land became very popular in the early 20th century because of Zionism and because of the new technology of dissemination of postcards, printed calendars, chromolithographs, all sorts of types of illustrations in magazines and newspapers. So they circulated, and there's a group of about 20 images that are particularly popular. The Wailing Wall, the Kotel, is the most popular. The Tomb of Rachel, very popular. The Tomb of the Patriarchs, popular, but not as common. This is the Vilna Shul, which I've mentioned a few other times, from 1919. In the women's section of the Vilna Shul, we get two images of scenes from the Holy Land. And this is the Stanton Street Shul in the Lower East Side, the last surviving little intact tenement shul there. And it has two paintings flanking the Ark of the Tower of David and the Tomb of Rachel. These have been repainted probably many times, but you get the idea. And a lot of the imagery came from these lithographs that were produced in Vienna and in Germany, Munich, I think, and maybe Berlin. And these still have to be studied. There are some people who are doing this work in Israel, but they're ephemeral. So we just find them in different places. And just curiously, I took this picture in the synagogue in Třebíč in the Czech Republic just months before I visited the Chelsea Street Synagogue in the Walnut Street Shul in 2018. And I didn't realize it at the time, but what I found there was this image in the center of the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs. And that is clearly what's represented here in the synagogue in Chelsea. And then later I found there's a representation of it, very faded, very hard to see, in a former prayer house in Krakow. And it's clearly labeled as such as the Midrash Hevra Tehillim, the tombs of the kings of the house of David. So, you know, it could be one or the other. It's not clear. This is one of these printed forms that is actually in the collection at the Walnut Street Shul. It is a memorial plaque. It's not a Mizrach. It's not one of these plaques to show which direction is east, but it's the same, it's a cousin, and they're printed by these publishing houses and circulated, and these become sources of imagery for painters. Okay, so just to close up, let's walk around once more the interior, and you'll see illusionistic architecture with the gallery. See how the columns are down below the gallery, and then they resume up above the gallery. So if you're looking across from where this picture is taken, you're supposed to see that as one continuous painting. But in fact, just like the windows themselves are interrupted by the floor of the women's gallery, so are the columns. And here you see some of that faux decoration. And here you get a view along the line. So let's end with this view of the outside again. And you know, I hope that you've enjoyed this visit to the Walnut Street Shul, thinking about the way the objects, just like the decorations that I've shown you in a synagogue, open the doors into many more types of, many more avenues for discussion. You know, we're in a synagogue, but we don't just have to talk about the liturgy and worship. We can talk about all aspects of Jewish life, because for so many, and particularly during this period of high immigration and the transition from Old World to New World Judaism, the synagogue was the hub of Jewish life, and it was also the fulcrum. It's from where people moved and spun off from. It's so we're lucky to have this place, and I urge you to visit when you're in the Boston area. And I look forward to talking to you again soon about another favorite Jewish space. Bye.